There are many mysteries at this grand and unaltered Queen Anne property. For a start, no record has ever been found of the architect who designed the present house, erected in 1721. It is certain that the Carew family came to Antony much earlier, probably in the 15th century. But of that house and the title Fishful Pond, why is there no trace? Sir Alexander Carew was hanged in December 1644, and his speech from the scaffold reveals a troubled mind. He wished for death. What is the story behind his portrait, from the cellars being restitched into its frame? Perhaps the portrait was cut from the frame when the family were ardent royalists, and Alexander Carew supported Parliament. And when he died, his family's sympathies were again with him, and his portrait was restitched into the frame. The church that William Henry Pole Carew built to commemorate the birth of his son, who laid the foundation stone when he was 16, was duly dedicated, but it was never fully consecrated. Was the artist Edward Bower, whose portrait of Charles I dominates the hall, a West Countryman, a pupil of Van Dyck? And why would John Carew, one of the judges at the King's trial, have such a portrait prominently displayed in the house? What is the story behind the picture known as the Horse Thief? And who was the artist? And quite apart from such prosaic mysteries, there are the ghost stories. One of the strangest of all ghost narratives is told of Antony House, for the ghost was that of a living person. In October 1880, Lady Helen Waldegrave visited Antony House, taking with her Helen Alexander, her reserved Scottish maid. The shy girl did not go out of her way to make friends with the servants of the house, although she did mention to one or two of them that she had a sister to whom she would be riding while she and her mistress were in Cornwall. She does not appear to have mentioned the fact that her mother and father were also alive. A few days after arriving in Antony House, Helen Alexander was taken ill. She quickly grew worse, and a doctor diagnosed typhoid fever. A trained nurse was sought, and until one was found, one of the housemaids, Frances Reddell, was detailed to look after the patient. An emotional and stolid girl, in no way imaginative or subject to nervous excitement, Frances was not in the least perturbed. When the patient seeming to go from bad to worse, she was asked to remain on duty at night. All was quiet and entirely normal in the bedroom where the patient was sleeping fitfully until 4 o'clock in the morning, when just as Frances Reddell was preparing a dose of medicine, due at that time for the sick girl, she heard a bell sound at the passage outside. Frances had noticed the same sound a few times previously, followed by complete silence, and she assumed that the bell wires had become tangled. Frances, therefore, continued with the preparation of medicine for her patient, and was very surprised when an elderly and stout lady entered the bedroom without any preliminary knock. Even more surprising to the puzzled Frances was the fact that the woman was dressed in a long red nightgown over a red flannel petticoat, and she carried an unusually ornate brass candlestick. The observant maidservant even noticed, with some disapproval, a definite hole in the petticoat apparently caused by stay busks. She was not in any way alarmed by the unexpected appearance of the figure, only momentarily surprised. And then she reasoned, Helen Alexander's mother must have been sent for, and had hurried to be by her daughter's side. She remained quietly observing the visitor for some moments. The rather odd figure crossed the room without speaking or even looking anywhere but straight ahead, and stopped when she reached the bedside of the sick girl. At this point, Frances turned to resume her preparation of the medicine, and when she turned back towards her patient, she was amazed to see no trace of the visitor, who only seconds before had crossed the room. In the 2 or 3 seconds that Frances' back had been turned, it was obviously quite impossible for anyone to have turned, recrossed the room, and left. Yet of the elderly woman she had so clearly seen, there was now no sign whatsoever. What was obvious was the deterioration of the patient's condition. She had worsened considerably, and the doctor was hurriedly called, but to no avail. Helen Alexander was dead within 2 hours. Two days later, the dead girl's family arrived at Antony House from Scotland. When Frances Reddle saw Helen's mother, she nearly fainted. In every physical aspect, this stout, elderly, motherly figure exactly resembled the apparition she had seen the night Helen had died. For a few days, the incident was not mentioned to the grieving family, but after the funeral, the whole story was told to the dead girl's sister. She immediately revealed that her mother did possess a nightgown and a red flannel petticoat exactly as the bewildered Frances Reddle described them. Furthermore, the petticoat had a hole where the busks of her stays had worn through, as Frances had mentioned. When asked about the unusually designed candlestick, which Frances said had been carried by the figure she had seen, the puzzled girl mentioned a brass candlestick that her mother used. It was exactly as Frances described, even down to the small dent she had noticed. There was yet one more strange detail in this very strange story. Helen had persistently refused to write home about her illness, insisting that she would soon be well again, and she did not want to worry her family. Yet, the evening before Helen died, her mother had suddenly remarked to her husband, "I'm worried about Helen. I have a feeling that she is very ill." One theory advanced in an attempt to explain this remarkable psychic puzzle, and it should be noted that from what is known of the participants, there is no reason to doubt the integrity of any of them, is that what Frances saw was a figure projected from the mind of the dying Helen. Yet, plausible as that may be, is it reasonable to assume that quiet and unimaginative Frances Reddle, described by all who knew her as completely down-to-earth, matter-of-fact, and without any imagination, and never given to flights of fancy, would be likely to pick up a thought of vision projected by a dying girl? It seems the only possible explanation. There are several versions of what is, in essence, the same story. In 1982, the administrator of Antony House, Mrs. Petey and Isaac, told me that the apparition or thought form was seen by Sir John Carew Pole's grandmother, who entered the room of the dying girl and saw sitting by the bedside a little old lady with a finger to her lips, indicating silence. Some hours later, a carriage arrived at the house bearing the said old lady, mother of the by then dead girl. When my old friend John Butler, Baker Street dentist and former amateur boxer, visited South Cornwall with a companion, they explored the lovely countryside west of Plymouth and came across an impressive house, which they entered and explored with interest, but without any guidebook. In particular, John always remembered the enormous stairway, which may have grown in his memory over the years. But he said it seemed so big that it might have taken 5 or 6 people abreast. They climbed the staircase completely at ease, and then suddenly, almost at the top, John came to a sudden stop and said he could not go on. He saw nothing, but felt an overwhelming compulsion not to continue, and not to explore the rooms upstairs. The feeling was so strong that he turned back and never did see the upper part of the house. Such an experience was quite alien to John Butler, a master mason, property owner, and confidant of special branch officers, and it was an experience that he never forgot. Once downstairs and outside, he and his friend had tea and found the outside of Antony House and the garden utterly charming. But nothing would induce him to climb the staircase there again. Years afterward, John Butler's secretary, cum dental nurse, acquired a history of Antony House. There discovered that some of the former inhabitants of the house had been named Butler. In 1901, Reginald Pole Carew married Lady Beatrice Butler, daughter of the 3rd Marquis of Ormond. What had happened, perhaps to someone with the surname of Butler, that so affected my friend? It is one more mystery associated with Antony House. Assembly rooms. Bath. Avon. Bath. Aquae Solis. So named from the British goddess of the waters. Sol a Solis. Has many ghosts, but unquestionably the best documented ghost in Bath, perhaps in the country, is the man in the black hat, whose spectral form has been repeatedly seen in the vicinity of the assembly rooms. These rooms were built in 1771 by John Wood, the younger, but gutted by German firebombs in 1942 and subsequently restored. Even the bombs could not destroy the mysterious man in the black hat. For judging from his apparel, he would seem to date from about the time the assembly rooms were erected, possibly earlier. In 1981, a party of Ghost Club members spent a day at Bath, where they sought out the haunted places and walked where ghosts have walked, under the benevolent guidance of Margaret Royal, a city guide who is a mine of information on the subject of ghosts in Bath and the surrounding area. She is the co-author of 3 collections of local ghost sightings. Witnesses for the ghostly man in a black hat go back many years, and there are references to the unidentified figure in private documents of the 18th and 19th centuries. But one of the best descriptions comes from Mrs. Cynthia Montefiore, who saw the figure in 1950. A fact that was reported in the Bath and Wilts Evening Chronicle, dated 16th March, 1950. During the course of her account of the experience, Mrs. Montefiore wrote, "I was walking from Portland Place to George Street. When I reached the end of Savile Row, a man approached me from the corner of Evans and Owen's store. He wore a large black hat, rather resembling the old-fashioned Quaker hat. He crossed the road noiselessly and came abreast of me as I gained the end of Savile Row. There was no one else in sight, and then I suddenly had the feeling that the person I was facing was odd and unearthly. I had that peculiar sinking feeling in the stomach, but I definitely did not feel frightened. I am much too interested in the occult to be afraid. As I passed, I turned around. I turned immediately. I just had to. I wanted to see his back. But he had vanished completely. He certainly had no time to enter a doorway, as not 2 seconds had passed from the time he passed until I looked back. I had a distinct view of him. He was small, thin, and walked with a stoop. Mrs. Montefiore provided a sketch of the figure she saw. This is one of the 4 sketches available that have been made independently by 4 different eyewitnesses who are all complete strangers to each other, but have all seen the man in the black hat. The other 3 were all sightings of the ghost in 1972 and were provided by 3 residents of Bath. Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Jill Dixon, and W.E.G. all depict a slightly stooping figure, and the predominant feature in each case is a large black hat. In May 1974, Mrs. Eileen Parrish of Elderly, Watton-under-Edge, wrote to say she too had seen the man in the black hat. She stated, "I was trying to park my car opposite Evans and Owens, and he came down Savile Row, stepped onto the road, hesitated, turned back, and began to walk towards the front of the assembly rooms. I took my eyes off him for a moment, and when I looked again, he had vanished, although he could not possibly have gotten to the end of the road. He was dressed very much like Guy Fawkes, and as he turned, his black cloak swirled around him. He seemed to have black breeches and gaiters on. I must admit that I never thought of him as being a ghost, which is strange, as I have had many ghostly experiences in Africa where I normally live, and I can always tell if a place is haunted. The same figure has been seen in different parts of the interior of the assembly rooms, and one report comes from a particularly reliable witness, former Regimental Sergeant Major Emmett, who was caretaker of the building for many years. One day he was stoking the boiler in the boiler room when he sensed that he was being watched. He turned at once, and in the doorway stood a figure in a cloak and black hat. As he stared, astonished at the presence of such a person in the boiler room, the figure slowly disappeared. Among other witnesses for the ghostly man in a black hat, there is the woman who was standing near the assembly rooms watching a film being made when she noticed an oddly dressed man standing beside her. There was something unpleasant about the dark figure wearing a black hat, and she suddenly felt very upset. And then suddenly, there was nobody standing beside her. The original assembly rooms, an important part of Bath at its most fashionable period, is mentioned in Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers and several times in the works of Jane Austen. It is interesting to speculate on the possibility that these literary giants and sensitive writers may have been aware of the psychic atmosphere of Bath's assembly rooms. Baddesley Clinton, Knowle, Solihul, Warwickshire. Parts of this medieval moated manor house date back to 1300, and it is little changed since 1634. Baddesley Clinton, a gem of beauty set in perfect surroundings, has long held many grim secrets within its stone walls. Here there are clever improvisations to cope with ancient emergencies, including provision for spanning the moat other than by the drawbridge, several secret passages and hiding places, and a devilish contrivance for pitching unwanted visitors into the deep waters of the silent moat. The house was probably built by one of the Catesbys, and it passed from that family to one John Brome, a lawyer who flourished in the reign of Henry VI. Brome was killed in London in a dispute with a man named Herthill over a mortgage. A death that was avenged by Brome's son, Nicholas, 3 years later when he waylaid Herthill and attacked him so fiercely that he later died. Nicholas Brome was required to do penance for his act, and he did that which was required of him. But his troubles were not over, for on his return home unexpectedly one day in 1485, he discovered his domestic chaplain in compromising circumstances with his wife, and being a man of hasty temper, Brome slew the priest on the spot, and so he was in serious trouble with the church yet again. This time, by way of expiation, he had to embellish the parish church at Baddesley Clinton and erect a new steeple for the church at Packwood. Nicholas Brome died in 1517, a man weary of this life, but whether it is his ghost or that of the priest he murdered, or possibly both, that haunts the old manor house is not known. But the haunting was sufficiently well authenticated at one time, or sufficiently well known, to be included in Charles Harper's classic work on haunted houses published in 1907. There have been a number of reported manifestations in the house that support the idea that the place is indeed haunted. Stories of the sound of muttered argument and disagreement between several men emanating from an empty room. Shadowy and silent forms and passages and rooms that are patently devoid of any human being. Footsteps stealthy and quick on occasions, and at other times heavy and leisured, have been repeatedly heard from many deserted parts of this house. Where tradition has it, Guy Fawkes once lived, and there has been unexplained movements of physical objects. On one occasion, at least, the atmosphere here has been completely overwhelming. One lady was so oppressed by the atmosphere in the library that immediately she had to leave that room. A room that has long been known as the ghost room. Nicholas Brome was the last of his line, and the house passed to the Ferrers family, who lived at Baddesley, Clinton, generation succeeding generation, until it came into the possession of the National Trust a few years ago. Many strange incidents seem to have taken place here about a century ago, and a diary, kept by a member of the Ferrers family, details some of these happenings and included signed statements by the recipients, as Meg Elizabeth Atkins recounts in her Haunted Warwickshire. There is the incident in 1884, when a lady visitor sleeping in the tapestry room woke suddenly and saw the figure of a fair-haired woman, dressed in black, glide past her bed and vanish through a closed door. 3 years later, this same lady visited Baddesley, Clinton again, and this time occupied the stateroom. Again she had a disturbed night, finding herself suddenly awake, and this time she saw the ghostly figure more clearly, since the room was flooded with moonlight. She was certain that it was the same form she had seen in the tapestry room, for the overall appearance, hair, and style of dress were the same. The form was standing beside the writing desk in the room, and she was facing the bed. Her features, the visitor thought, had a definite resemblance to those of the Ferrers family, and the moment the figure disappeared. Other people also saw this figure, both employees and guests, and it seems that she always appeared in the upper part of the house, usually inside a bedroom, but occasionally in one of the corridors. Once, a visiting clergyman entered his room and found the ghost sitting in a chair. A moment later, she was no longer there. Major Thomas Ferrers died in an accident abroad. 70 years after his death, his ghost was seen and recognized from a portrait by a guest. On a second visit, she saw him again, seemingly surrounded by a gilt frame, almost like a picture. And the whole appearance was superimposed on one of the pictures hanging in the room. A similar ghostly experience was reported some years later in the Blue Room by a visitor who had no knowledge of the history of the house or its reputed ghosts. An exorcism seems to have laid the ghost of Major Ferrers. In the early 1900s, yet another guest, Miss Henrietta Knight, spent an eventful and frightening night at Baddesley, Clinton. She was awakened by the sound of footsteps on the staircase outside her room. Footsteps that were of such variety and volume that she judged there must be at least 4 or 5 people involved. When these sounds ceased, they were replaced by rapping sound that seemed to emanate from the walls and flooring of the room. Then she heard the noise of cloth being torn, and finally the sound of breathing that seemed to be very close beside her. Again, a service of exorcism was held at Baddesley, Clinton. The present administrator has told me about 2 incidents and supplied me with the names and addresses of the people concerned. Some 40 years ago, the ghost of a priest was reportedly seen celebrating Mass in the chapel. This form was also seen to remove vestments or something from a box and deposit whatever it was on top of a box in the sacristy. No reason or historical fact has ever been discovered for this curious ghostly performance, but perhaps it has something to do with the murdered chaplain, for he does seem to have left behind some psychic influence, that is evident from the second incident. This concerned a visitor who was about to enter the solar, but discovered that he was unable to do so because of an overwhelming feeling of an unseen presence in the immediate vicinity. This visitor was completely unaware of the murder here in 1485. There is also a ghost story associated with the Red Room at Baddesley, Clinton. This concerns a member of the family who owned the house at the time of Waterloo. He was a soldier, and being killed in battle apparently did not receive Christian burial, and perhaps for that reason his ghost has appeared on more than one occasion to people sleeping in the Red Room. Following a special mass after entreating the Pope, his soul was comforted and he did not appear again. Mr. G. Howard Heaton tells me that 50 years ago, when he was a young man, he spent a good deal of time at Baddesley, and in those days the house was occasionally opened in aid of the Red Cross. He continues, I, who knew the place well, acted as guide to parties of the visiting public, and on several occasions when we passed out of the chapel into the small closet adjoining, we would find a set of priest's vestments lying on the floor as if they had been cast off in a hurry. Once, when I mentioned this to the then owner, this was before the property passed into the National Trust, she told me that she had a similar experience, and added that she had been into the room in question that morning when everything had been in order. These vestments were kept in a large, bow-fronted chest of drawers in the room, so that they could lie unfolded. The theory is that in the days of the persecution of the Catholics, if a priest was celebrating Mass when government troops or officials arrived, he would leave as quickly as possible, and in such a case of urgency he would discard his vestments and use a ladder in the passage under the room, leading to the passage on the ground floor, and he would then flee across the moat through the secret opening in the wall. These passages are still open, I believe, and I have been inside them all in those far-off days. Bateman's, Burwash, East Sussex. This 17th century house was the home of Rudyard Kipling from 1902 until his death in 1936. The great writer was always aware of the paranormal, and indeed he had a psychic sister, Mrs. Holland, who received many messages through automatic writing that seemed to emanate from the dead. Messages that many people consider far more intelligent and thoughtful than the majority of such scripts. Some of the rooms at Bateman's, including the study, remain exactly as they were during Kipling's lifetime. He designed the garden that leads down to the mill on the Dudwell, and it seems likely the reports of the house being quietly haunted by the presence of Kipling may well be true, especially his study and his garden. Antony Hippisley Cox tells me that the house is haunted by the ghost of Kipling, and that his ghost and that of his wife have been seen in the garden. The whole place is full of atmosphere, and it is easy to imagine Kipling's presence in many parts of the house and garden. Where the Dudwell stream flows, for example, is the setting of the Puck of Pook's Hill stories and Rewards and Fairies, both books full of a strange enchantment. In 1975, some members of the Ghost Club visited Bateman's, and John Harvey, a long-standing and practical member, who did not usually see or experience anything of a psychic nature, encountered the unmistakable figure of the supreme storyteller and master of magic atmosphere standing by his desk in the study, apparently looking out of the window. As John Harvey stood quietly in the doorway, taking in the seemingly solid and vigorous figure who had often talked about inherited continuity, another member came along and attempted to pass into the room. John Harvey turned to point out the figure of the Nobel Prize winner who had always been so deeply interested in what he called haunted landscapes. And when he turned back, the figure had completely disappeared and the room was empty. Invisible presences have also been experienced in Bateman's, both by official guides and by visitors. One witness described to me the unmistakable feeling of the presence of someone with enormous enthusiasm and energy in various parts of the house, but especially in the study at dusk. And I treasure the enigmatic sentence contained in a letter to me by the administrator in 1975, to whom I had written on a mundane matter, and then had casually asked about any ghosts. The sentence reads, "As to whether Bateman's is haunted, that is another story." In 1982, the present administrator, who had only been there a year, told me that on my behalf he had researched many of the past tenants of the house since Kipling, those alive, that is, not anymore. But none of them could give any details or recount any happenings. The only comment was received from a Mrs. Lees, who lived at Bateman's in the 1940s. And she said she had always felt uneasy in the room in which Mr. and Mrs. Kipling slept. Mr. R.C. Taylor goes on to say that during the short time he and his wife have been there, nothing untoward has occurred, and in fact we find the whole house very friendly. He does add, by way of a postscript, that a character nearby tells the tale of Mrs. Kipling's ghost walking at night in the garden and carrying a basket which she used to sit on. But Mr. Taylor has doubts about this witness's sobriety. Years ago, R. Thurston Hopkins, who wrote some fascinating books about ghosts and knew Kipling well during his latter years, told me that towards the end of his life the great man would often stand and fix his eyes like some old eagle on the blunt bow-headed whale-backed downs and say, "These hills are full of pure magic." The continuity of this moment is forever, and this now is everlasting. Nearby Glidwish Wood, now sadly all but disappeared, held a strange fascination for Kipling, and he believed that it was full of a sense of ancient ferocity and evil. He told Thurston Hopkins, who wrote a biography of Kipling, "I have sometimes, while taking an evening walk through it, felt a secretive and menacing feeling all around me, holding me expectant and always on guard. In that evil wood, everything is evil. There's a horrible suggestion of intelligence. It's not as though the woods were lonely or anything. It's not empty. There's too much life there, a kind of ill-natured and venomous life. There is a spirit of some kind there, for one evening something suddenly gripped me, and despite my attempts to walk forward, I was gradually forced back. I felt some unseen, unknown power pushing against me. And in the end, I was compelled to turn around and leave the wood. Some years later, Thurston Hopkins organized a midnight ghost hunt through the heart of Glidwish Wood, and one of the hunters encountered more than he had bargained for. He had heard something scrambling with incredible swiftness through the mud and bramble, and then out of the undergrowth blundered the shape of a man, a form that came staggering towards him, coughing, choking, moaning as it did so, its hands clutching at its throat. The startled ghost hunter forced himself to look into the horrible eyes and flesh of a face that was withered and decayed, and he knew instinctively that the man had been hanged, and that he was looking at someone who had been dead for many years. He never knew how he got out of the wood and back among his companions. After lengthy research, Thurston Hopkins discovered that a man named David Leaney had been hanged for a murder committed in Glidwish Wood in 1928. After the execution had been carried out, fresh medical evidence showed that in fact the victim had died of a heart attack. The condemned man had protested his innocence to the end, and his last words to the chaplain were, "I beg of you to believe me when I say I am innocent, and to prove it I shall return to haunt those people who have hounded me to my death." Bedruthan, Cornwall. These 60 acres of National Trust cliff-top land overlooking Bedruthan Beach and the rock formation known as Bedruthan Steps include sites of ancient tin and iron mines, and perhaps even a castle that may have been named after the red ironstone that abounds here and in other parts of Cornwall. Standing here, facing countless miles of ocean and completely alone, it seems even when other people are in sight, it is not difficult to believe that there are many visitors who have reported hearing sounds they cannot explain. The heavy and weary tread of long-dead miners' boots and the click-click of the knockers' picks. Although in the main, the miners were afraid of these withered, dried-up creatures the size of a 2-year-old child, with large eyes and ugly heads. The knockers were usually only to be found in the vicinity of rich lodes of tin, and so they were tolerated and endured. Indeed, according to the 1975 publication The Folklore of Cornwall, they are still feared in the far west of the country. Many are the stories of miners and others who have encountered and not infrequently felt the power of these little people. When I was at Bedruthan in 1981, I met a local man who told me that here, where there were iron mines centuries ago, he has many times heard faint clicks from the ground. Sounds that he and others accept as being produced by knockers. Once, he saw a creature himself and fled for his life from the sight. Bellister Castle, Haltwhistle, Northumberland. The vicinity of the border fortress Bellister Castle, which is not open to the public apart from existing rights of way, has long been regarded as being haunted by a grey man. In folklore, greyness is the symbol of grief, and perhaps the grief and remorse of some ancient lord of Bellister plays its part in the appearance of the ghost of the old and defenseless man whose death he caused. Nearby Blenkinsop Castle, where there are at least 2 ghosts, was the home of the de Blenkinsop family for more than 200 years before they moved to Bellister Castle in 1542. The tragic event that is said to have given rise to the haunting is preserved in an old ballad, and the story goes that an old traveling minstrel was in the habit of calling at Bellister and providing entertainment in return for food and a night's lodging. He became a frequent and welcome visitor, until one night the Lord of Bellister became suspicious. Those were troubled days, full of border feuds, with surprise Scottish raiding parties always a possibility. And that fateful night, the Lord of Bedlester began to wonder whether the old man could really be a spy. An enemy agent who sought to lull the occupants of a border castle into a sense of security before hastening across the border with news of another castle ripe for the picking. The more he thought about it, the more the master of Bellister decided he was probably right. After the old man had left, he roused his sleeping servants and retainers, told them to take fierce dogs with them, and hunt down the man he believed would betray them all. The pursuit was quickly organized. Horses were hastily saddled, for the lord and his men and bloodhounds were released on the trail of the old musician. The dogs caught up with him on the banks of the Tyne, where the hounds almost tore the defenseless old man to pieces before the arrival of the Baron and his men. Too late, they called off the savage dogs. The old man was dead. Thereafter, the form of an old grey man haunted the woods and lanes adjacent to the castle. A dreadful spectacle. The ancient features terribly gashed and torn, and the blood running into the white beard. It was a terrifying sight for those who came face to face with the spectre, and dreaded by all who dwelt in the neighborhood for centuries after the story of the frightful death of the old man had spread far and wide. Another version of the story has it that the old man was rescued before he had been killed by the dogs and was speedily hanged from the branch of an ancient tree in front of Bellister Castle, a tree known to this day as the Hanging Tree. Whatever the truth of the matter, it seems possible that something like the traditional story of the death of an old man happened hereabouts, and that subsequently the area was, and perhaps still is, haunted by a ghostly old grey man. Then MacDhui, the Cairngorms, Highland, Scotland. This main peak of the Cairngorms, with its flat and bare summit, has long been associated with an unusual spectral presence known as the Big Grey Man of Ben MacDhui. Over the years, a considerable volume of evidence has been collected from various people to suggest that something very strange happens on this mountain from time to time. As long ago as 1891, Norman Colley, professor of organic chemistry at the University of London and a fellow of the Royal Society, stated that as he was returning from the cairn to the summit in a mist, he heard footsteps following him, but seeming to take steps that were 3 or 4 times the length of his own. He stopped several times, but he could see nothing. Eventually terror seized him, and he took to his heels and ran blindly for several miles until he saw the Rothenmirkis forest ahead, and he realized that at last the mysterious footsteps were no longer following him. In the summer of 1904, Hugh Welsh and his brother spent a fortnight camping near the summit, collecting alpine plants and studying the spiders there. The first night they both heard soft footsteps following them wherever they stirred. Later they heard more distinct footsteps in the daylight, and they were both very conscious of something near them. An eerie experience on an apparently deserted mountain. They never saw anything or discovered any explanation for the sounds. In the early 1920s, Tom Crowley, one-time president of the Moray Mountaineering Club, was descending Ben MacDhui when he suddenly heard footsteps behind him. And looking over his shoulder, he saw a huge gray figure, misty, undefined, but with long legs. He turned and fled. Dr. A.M. Kellis, who died during the 1921-22 Mount Everest reconnaissance expedition, was a very experienced climber. One clear June night, he was on the summit of Ben MacDhui with his brother. They were resting a little way apart from each other. Suddenly, much to his astonishment, Kellis saw a figure climbing up out of the Lerrig Gru Pass. It walked round the cairn and disappeared again into the pass. As far as Keller was aware, he and his brother were the only people on the summit at the time. But most of all, he was amazed at the enormous size of the figure he saw, for it passed close to a 10-foot cairn and seemed to be about the same height. George Duncan, a former High Sheriff of Aberdeen, saw a tall figure in a black robe as he drove along the Derry Road at dusk after coming off the mountain one evening in 1914. The figure appeared to be waving long arms in a menacing fashion, and the veteran mountaineer felt a cold shiver run down his spine before he turned a corner and the figure was lost to view. In 1982, Joan Grant was suddenly overwhelmed with terror as she and her husband were walking in brilliant sunshine in the Rothenmirkis forest towards the Cairngorms. She turned and fled back the way they had come. She was utterly convinced that something malign, four-legged, and obscenely human and invisible yet solid, for she could hear the pounding of hooves, was trying to reach her. A year later, a visiting professor described an almost identical experience in the same area, and a correspondence in the Times claimed to have been pursued by something invisible. In 1941, Miss Wendy Wood, the well-known Scottish nationalist, fled in terror from the Lerrig Gru Pass. She said she had heard a voice of gigantic resonance suddenly close behind her. Then she heard heavy footsteps which seemed to follow her, and as she hurried away, she had the impression something was walking immediately behind her. She decided that the footsteps must be some kind of echo, and then discovered, to add to her fear, that the heavy crunch behind her did not coincide with her own progress. She raced down the mountain, oblivious to the fact that she might fall and injure herself, until near Whitwell, a barking dog drew her mind back to the world of reality, and she realized that the footsteps were no longer following her. In 1943, Alexander Tunian, another experienced mountaineer and also a noted naturalist and photographer, was climbing alone on Ben MacDhui one October afternoon, and as he reached the summit, a dense mist spread across Llarig Grew, enveloping the mountain. As the wind rose, Tunian feared that a storm was imminent, and he retreated down the queer Echekian path. As he did so, he heard first one loud footstep echoing through the wind, and then another, and another, spaced out at long intervals. Tunian carried a revolver, and he turned and peered into the mist. Suddenly, a huge shape loomed up, receded, and then came towards him again. He fired 3 times at the figure, but it still came on, and Tunian turned and ran away down the path without another backward glance. He always said he reached Glenderry in a time he never bettered. In 1942, veteran mountaineer Sid Scroggy was standing at the shelter stone at Ben MacDhui, alone at twilight, when he distinctly saw a tall human figure appear out of the blackness at one side of Loch Etcacan. Below, and clearly silhouetted against the water, walk with long and deliberate steps across the burns and disappear into the blackness at the other side of the loch. He quickly made his way to where the figure had appeared, but he could find no footprints, and there was now no sign of the mysterious figure. He shouted, but there was no reply, and as he became aware of the approaching darkness and the silence of the brooding Cairngorms, he hurried back to the shelter stone. These are but some of the strange experiences reported from Ben MacDhui. Reports that have convinced many hardened mountaineers and other shrewd observers, including the naturalist Henry Tegner, that something out of the ordinary does on occasions take place in these haunted mountains. Berkeley, Gloucestershire. For more than 800 years, the storms of history have washed over the impressive ramparts of Berkeley Castle, and it seems likely that something of the turbulent past still lingers about this noble and historic building. A deep well or dungeon still exists in the old keep where carcasses of animals and probably troublesome humans were thrown in days gone by. For any commoner or thief who incurred the displeasure of the Lord of Berkeley was summarily dispatched to the depths of the sinister well, where there is still stagnant water. Those of nobler birth, who displeased the long line of Berkeleys, were likely to find themselves imprisoned in the tiny windowless cell that once stood above the dungeon, and there left to inhale the stench of the rotting corpses below. Such is the treatment that King Edward II received after he had been hounded, captured, and imprisoned at Berkeley by orders of Queen Isabel, who had become the lover of Roger Mortimer, Edward's usurper. For one Thomas Lord of Berkeley had married the daughter of Roger Mortimer. The Queen had no intention of allowing the king to leave Berkeley Castle alive, but after 5 months in the loathsome cell, the robust king had not sickened and died on the instructions of the Queen, more drastic action was undertaken. The men responsible for the king's captivity were Sir John Maltravers and Sir Thomas Gurney, and they lost no time in acting on the Queen's orders. With an imagination that could have been used to better advantage, Edward II was a homosexual, and his jailers thought the manner of his death should be seen to be appropriate. They seized the king on the night of the 21st of September, 1327, pinioned him with legs spread, and a kind of horn or funnel was thrust into his fundament, through which a red-hot spit was run up his bowels. Small wonder that the shrieks of the tortured king were said to have been heard far outside the castle walls, and that there are those that say the dying screams can still be heard today. I asked the present owner, Major R.J.G. Berkeley, whether he had any knowledge of the ghost sounds, but he told me that as far as he knows, no one has heard them. I asked poet and writer Laurie Lee whether he had any information, for I knew that his mother's forebears lived in Berkeley. He said he had no first-hand evidence, but it is strong hearsay, and his mother often repeated the story to him, although she did not claim herself to have heard the sounds. Sir Reginald Blacker quoted to me a couple of relevant lines of poetry. Shrieks that through Berkeley's roof did ring, shrieks of an agonizing king. He tells me he has made extensive inquiries, but has never discovered the source of these lines, or whether they pertain to the legend of the everlasting screams. Certainly the carving on the king's sepulchre, said to have been copied directly from a contemporary death mask, shows a haunting look of twisted anguish. Tragic and violent happenings sometimes leave some kind of impression on the atmosphere that still registers for certain people years, even centuries later. Barrington Hall, Leominster, Hereford and Worcester. Designed by one of the leading architects of the day, Capability Brown's son-in-law, Henry Holland, and standing in a park laid out by Brown, this late 18th century house is something of a mystery. In fact, practically nothing is known of the history of Berrington before Thomas Harley bought the estate about 1775. But there are traces of a medieval house about a half a mile from the present one. Harley's daughter, Anne, inherited the estate from her father and married the son and heir of Admiral Lord Rodney. Much of the house is scarcely altered since it was built, including the hall, library, drawing room, boudoir, and the staircase that is reputedly haunted. I am told that in May 1981, a dark figure was seen walking in the southeast wing, used as a hospital during both World Wars. The figure was seen to emerge from the upper ward, and it turned as if intending to go down the stairs. Who the figure is and why it walks is yet to be discovered. Perhaps it is associated with some part of the history of the house that we know nothing about.